So some overviews before we do roll call. Remember that all direct comments are directed through the chairman, and that will stay on the issue that's being discussed, and speakers will avoid personal criticism of the representatives or anybody in the room. With that, could we have roll call?
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. Senator Brightman,
He's going to be excused.
Senator Brennan. Okay. Senator Rothfuss,
Here.
Senator Steinmetz, Representative Allred, Representative Andrew, Representative Berger,
Here.
Representative Brown, Representative Costin,
Here.
Representative Lawley,
Here.
Representative Obermueller,
Here.
Representative Provenza,
Here.
Co-Chairman Scott,
Here.
Co-Chairman Northrup.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you. All righty. Co-Chairman Scott, do you have any comments?
Well, one thing I would like to say is that at this first meeting, we're particularly interested in comments from the public and any interested groups. They're more valuable at this point because we've got more time to deal with them. So I would encourage people that are here and want to speak up to go ahead and do so.
Good point, Chairman Scott. All right. Senator Rothfuss had a comment also, and he would like to give us a little information. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I did want to just raise something that we talked about last night, which is for the first time, the state of Wyoming, for the 2023 graduating class was first in the country on the ACT scores for those students that took states that have 100% testing. And in fact, we even beat those that had only 98% testing as well. So this is the first year that we've taken that position. We've seen the students, obviously, that we've seen grow with good NAEP scores in 4th grade, moving to 8th grade. And now we see that class graduating. And so we can see some good work that this committee, the legislature, our educators, our superintendents, our administrators all around the state have been putting in over the last decade is now paying off in a graduate level. So I just wanted to make sure everybody knew that. And in fact, for the 2023 class, it achieved a 19 as the average score. 19 is the college ready score for the ACT test. So it's kind of interesting to see that that's a line that we've been shooting for. We have that as I believe our opportunity level of our Hathaway, and that means that the average graduating senior for the state is eligible for the ACT side of that. So I think that's just good work to everybody. I wanted to provide that announcement. It shows that the hard work that the educators in the state of Wyoming have been putting in is paying off, and it's nice to see us at the top of that list as well.
Go ahead, Representative Berger.
I also want to recognize, just to add to the good senator's comments, there was a perfect score out there as well. There was a 36 and amazing. We have great teachers, great board members. We have great people doing great things in Wyoming, and congratulations to those who take the ACT, the work keys. I know in my district, there's kids that optioned out for the work keys and ended up there's 3-4 that were able to receive Hathaway scholarship because of their score on the work keys. So amazing things are going on.
Go ahead, Chairman Scott.
Question, what % of our high school graduating class takes that test, and how does that compare to the other states?
Thank you. So we have a 100% testing rate junior year, and then our students can retake it thereafter. So when we're looking at our scores, those are towards the end of spring junior year is what our 100% is based on. And then students obviously will take it again if they choose to during their senior year. There are, I believe, 10 states that are at the 100 level, and some are a couple more at the 98-ish level, and then it drops off from there, Mr. Chairman.
So congratulations to the education people in the room and across the state. We've done a great job, and we appreciate it. We like to see that kind of results, and that's, of course, what everybody's been striving for. So thank you. All right, we'll get back onto the agenda, and early childhood education or pre-kindergarten is our first subject. We are going to be at our current state governance structure with Shelley Hamill and Matt Petrie, Roxanne O'Connor, Elizabeth, I'll mess that one up, and Lachelle Brandt. So welcome and take it away. Good morning, Shelley. How are you doing? Good. That's great.
Morning, Mr. Chairman. Can everybody see my screen over Zoom land? Okay, great. Well, I call it a successful morning already. Good morning, Mr. Chairman. My name is Roxanne O'Connor. I'm the Support Services Senior Administrator for Department of Family Services. We are so excited to be talking to you this morning about a really important topic, a topic that I think melds well into the conversation that we just had about successful educational outcomes. And I'm also excited to be sharing the stage with a number of great colleagues who I will let introduce themselves, and then we'll get started with our presentation.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and Committee. Shelley Hamill with the Wyoming Department of Education, I'm the Chief Academic Officer there.
Morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Matt Petrie. I'm the Senior Administrator of the Behavioral Health Division, at the Department of Health.
Well, good morning, and thank you for coming.
And Mr. Chairman, we also have Director Gagan online for Department of Workforce Services.
Hello, this is Liz Gagan, and I am the Director of the Department of Workforce Services.
Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just a quick overview of what we're going to be discussing today and who you'll be hearing from. The request was to hear from all departments who have a role in early care and education. That will be the 4 departments that you just heard mentioned and represented here today. We'll talk about that infrastructure and how those programs align and intersect and how they have varying programs as well. You'll hear that from Department of Family Services, and then you'll hear more of the educational lens from Department of Health and Department of Education as well, with workforce in there. And it'll be a great segue from Department of Workforce Services, or excuse me, Department of Family Services, in speaking about childcare providers and some of the workforce constraints that they are experiencing. So from Department of Family Services, you'll be hearing about childcare licensing, like I mentioned, the Child Care Assistance Program, which is an income eligible program for families to be able to assist with affordability of childcare. You'll hear about resource and referral, which is how we connect families to early care and education, and the coordination of the Early Childhood State Advisory Council as well. And then from Department of Education, we will be hearing from Shelley about the IDEA program, the Head Start program, TANF preschools, and the education savings accounts, which we know is on the agenda a little bit later, so it'll probably be a high-level overview. The Department of Health will talk about their IDEA Part B and Part C programs, and then Department of Workforce Services will talk about their Y Quality Counts program. So although you're hearing from 4 different agencies today, we did want to highlight that all of our efforts collectively really focus on ensuring that there is affordable access to early care and education that helps to promote health, child development, social and emotional development, literacy, and education for our youngest children in Wyoming. We see that these programs can be tied to early outcomes as well as long-term outcomes for children, families, communities, not only from an educational standpoint, but also from a child welfare standpoint and an economic development standpoint as well. A theme that you will be hearing throughout the conversation is that there is not a statewide definition of preschool. And so I'll talk about that a little bit more as we get into licensing. But when we talk about childcare licensing, we truly license from a brick and mortar health and safety perspective and not necessarily from a program and a curriculum perspective. And you'll hear that throughout the other programs as well on not having a statewide definition of that, as well as a statewide definition of kindergarten readiness. And so really trying to define programmatically what outcomes look like and talking about kindergarten readiness and what that means from an ECE perspective tends to be a little tricky because we don't have a defined definition of either preschool or kindergarten readiness. On slide 5, you will see a high-level overview of the programs that we're going to be discussing. This is kind of your really high-level dashboard, if you will, of our program. So it provides you with the population served, those numbers for each of the programs, as well as the funding amount for those programs and whether or not that funding is federal fund or state general fund. You'll hear this peppered throughout the conversation, but this is just a nice summary for all of you. So now into Department of Family Services and our programs. So really quickly, the Department of Family Services approaches all of its work through a lens that we call Why Home Matters. And Why Home Matters really ties to our core values as an agency. And you can see those in the 3 boxes presented here. Those core values are safe at home, opportunities for success, and supporting the people who support the families. And we see that throughout our early care and education programs. We believe that if a family has access to childcare, that then that family is able to go to work or have education. They're able to look for employment, so that then helps to provide security with the home where those children reside. That again helps to strengthen families. It provides opportunities for self-sufficiency. And then we really see in communities through programs such as TANF Preschools, where we are able to align community needs with the needs of specific children within those communities to be able to support families and support those children. So in the Department of Family Services, like I mentioned, we have the child care licensing program that includes professional development and quality. So we ensure that through our licensing requirements that staff have a minimum level of training requirements, and we ensure that we get that training to them and make it accessible to them. And then that also lends itself to the quality aspect of early care and education. Again, we have our child care assistance program and our resource and referral program, which is our way that we connect families to child care providers that meet their needs in their communities. Per Wyoming Statute 144101, DFS licenses child care providers who are required to be licensed. And we have a visual that will help to really drill into what it means to be licensed. We have 552 licensed childcare providers in the state. That has declined over the years, and I think we mentioned that last year as well, that we continue to see a decline of licensed childcare providers throughout the state. And you'll be hearing in a few moments some of the initiatives that we have in DFS to help with the access issue that we're seeing across the state from a childcare perspective. And then we have a capacity of about 21,500 slots. So there's the licensed number of slots, that's how many children can be served. But we also need to be mindful that you have to have staff in order to care for those children. So that's your highest level of capacity. If you don't have staff and a workforce to be able to care for children, most programs aren't able to operate at their full capacity.
Scott.
Question on that, what percentage of the potential child population is going to one of your licensed providers? And how does that vary? That does vary by age, does it not?
Mr. Chairman, Chairman Scott, so I think if I'm hearing your question correctly, you're wanting to know how many children are able to access childcare and then what the gap is. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
well, how many of and what percentage of the possible is that? Because you have a certain number of kids in each of those age groups. And I'm trying to figure out, are you dealing with 50% of them or 40% or 70%? I don't know.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification, Mr. Chairman. So through the Bipartisan Policy Center, there was a study that was conducted in 2022. Wyoming participated in that study and found that the child care gap in Wyoming is about 27.6%. So of the number of children that would need child care and the number of families that are in the workforce, the gap between the number of children needing care and the number of families that are in the workforce is about 27.6%, or approximately 5,000 children. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not informal ways of caring for those children, right? Where there's a family, friend, and neighbor network. That could be a number that's a little high just because of that information that's unknown to the department, because we don't regulate family care or friend or neighbor care, right? So we don't know where those children are attending. But from a license and a capacity perspective, that's the gap that we're aware of.
Roxanne, can you tell us the approximate age of that group that's not being served?
Mr. Chairman, the Bipartisan Policy Center looked up to age 5. So it was 0 to 5 was the age range for those children. I can see if we can drill down further into age. That's going to take a little bit of research, and we can get back to you on that. So, Mr. Chairman, our childcare licensing program, as well as the other programs that I mentioned through the Department of Family Services, are funded by the Child Care Development Block Grant. And the block grant, as well as some research-based best practices, help to inform the basic health and safety standards that we use to license childcare programs. Again, these tie right back to health and safety. When we're speaking about curriculum, there's very few of our rules that speak to actual curriculum and programming outside of training and some required child development training that we have within our rules. We already mentioned that there's not a definition of preschool, which also lends itself to we license based on the size of a center, not necessarily the curriculum of a center. And this map right here is just some basic information about the number of licensed childcare providers within the state by county. And the scale on the side just tells you where there's some more dense populations, and then you likely see some childcare programs that align with that supply in each county.
Senator Provenza, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question. I know when we looked at mental health providers by area, we had a much larger number than those that were actually available for folks. So I'm wondering if these are numbers of licensed child care providers, but not necessarily available or servicing children at this time. Do you know that kind of differential number?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Provenza. So these are the number of licensed childcare providers that our licensors go and visit on a regular basis. And so we know that these ones are operating. Again, to the point of whether they're operating at capacity is a different question. And what we see across the state is that the vast majority do not operate at their full license capacity due to staffing constraints, yes. So oftentimes we get asked the question, who's required to be licensed and who isn't, right? And then we go back to, again, Wyoming statute 144101 to define what a child caring institution is. And so on the left-hand side of this chart, you'll see these are the programs that are required to be licensed in Wyoming. So again, they are by size. You have child care centers, which are your largest programs and serve children outside of home-based programs. And then you have family child care centers, which are in homes of providers. However, they are a little bit bigger because they are allowed to have a staff person. So their maximum capacity for serving children is 15, whereas your smallest providers that are in home are able to serve up to 10 children per one person in their home. And again, those are your smallest providers. These providers may or may not accept childcare assistance. They have to follow the childcare licensing rules. And then if they accept childcare assistance, they also follow our childcare purchase of service rules, which really are pretty much one and the same from a compliance perspective, if you will. And then we have statutorily exempt programs, which are this middle column. And these are your before and after school programs, as well as your family friend and neighbor programs, as long as the number of children being served is low. So you can serve from a family friend and neighbor perspective, you can serve up to one family or two unrelated children and not have to be required to be licensed in Wyoming. Again, if these providers choose to accept childcare assistance, they would have to comply with our childcare purchase of service rules, which are a little watered down, right, from a licensing perspective. They're not required to be licensed and meet all of those requirements. They are required to meet our childcare development block grant requirements because they're receiving federal funding from a childcare assistance perspective. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see these are the programs that are statutorily exempt. And if they don't accept childcare assistance, they remain unknown to the department. And so we have numbers on the number of exempt providers that provide childcare assistance because we know them and they're known to our agency from an assistance perspective. We don't know the number of unregulated childcare programs in the state because they're just that, they are unregulated, and so they don't need to be known to us. And so that's where you'll see the occasional family friend or neighbor. You'll see summer camps, again, the daycare providers who are providing assistant or care for one family unit, less than 3 children, before and after school programs, and then really small part-time preschools is our newest exemption. So I really just kind of covered this slide. Again, we don't know the number of exempt programs if they're not known to the state. And this is just a summary of the programs that are exempt from licensing. And then in this visual, you will see those numbers of providers who, again, accept childcare assistance because that's how they're known to DFS. But we know that there are more exempt providers that don't accept assistance, and then we won't know that number because we are not involved with them. So I mentioned that the Child Care Development Block Grant is the funding source for childcare licensing, our childcare assistance program, child care resource and referral, all of our early care and education programs within DFS. That is a $21 million per year block grant. Approximately 70% of those funds are federal funds. The state is required to have a $5.6 million match and MOE each year, maintenance of effort, excuse me, each year, in order to be able to receive the full amount of the block grant. As part of the block grant, we do have prescriptions and how the vast majority of that funding is used. And so we have a 3% infant and toddler set aside that goes to the University of Wyoming Professional Learning Collaborative. The Professional Learning Collaborative is a program that has about 7 educators across the state who provide training and education to early care and education providers from a child development perspective, from a perspective of family inclusion, from a perspective of trauma-informed care. So really trying to elevate the quality and the professionalism of early care and education staff. And so some of those dollars go directly to teaching providers on safe sleep for infant care, how to be able to manage, different issues when it comes to serving infants and being able to help families in a supportive way as well.
Senator Office, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm curious about the federal funding on this, how that ends up being calculated. Is there anything that is flexible or variable from the state's perspective that could lead to an increased availability of those federal funds, or is it largely based on population and demographics calculations?
Go ahead, Roxanne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Rothfuss, yes, you hit it on the mark with your latter comment about looking at population based, the number of income eligible, free and reduced lunch numbers all go into the formulaic way that we receive the amount of funding that we have from a block grant perspective. So, Mr. Chairman, our other set aside is our quality set aside, which again, we help to pay our licensing staff with those dollars and fund the Professional Learning Collaborative, again, that collaborative through the University of Wyoming, as well as our Professional Development Registry. So this is how we get our training to our professionals who are serving children across the state. And then our largest set aside is 70% direct services or child care assistance to families. So again, this is our income eligible program to help families be able to afford child care within their communities. It's a means-based program, and it uses a sliding fee scale based on federal poverty level to determine the amount of benefits that we can provide, as well as the amount that the family pays towards their child care program. A child care assistance, a family has to be engaged in a qualifying activity, which is either work, education, training, job search, or sleep time if the individuals are shift workers. So making sure that children are not at home with sleeping parents, but are being well taken care of in a child care program. Additionally, we have an administrative cap of 5%. We don't use that full cap. Some of those dollars go to direct services as well. But that's the cap that we use to operate our system. And then, like I said, anything else that remains in the block grant goes to direct assistance and ensuring that we're meeting the 50th percent threshold from our market rate survey and the rates that we pay providers. I mentioned the access issue, and I wanted to highlight some of the initiatives that DFS, along with many partners, have embarked on to try to assist with the access issue and really ensure that families are able to have the care that they need for their children and then be able to go and be a part of those qualifying activities that I mentioned. We have increased our payment rates from the 45th percentile to the 50th percentile based on our last market rate survey in 2022. It doesn't sound like a lot, but to put it in a little bit of perspective, the last time that rates were changed for childcare assistance was in 2012, and they were reduced. And so making an increase to rates and being able to do that through a sustainable way was a pretty substantial move. Additionally, we have a new rule coming through for the block grant, and a part of that rule is that we pay providers based on enrollment instead of attendance to mirror private pay practices so that providers can have a predictable revenue stream when they're serving children who are on child care assistance and know that they will be receiving the same amount of payment for serving that child, regardless if that child is sick or unable to attend, they'll still receive that funding to be able to operate their program. From a technology perspective, we are embarking on a system that's called eCares. I refer to it as the really cool system because I think that's what it is. And so we are working on the development of that system right now to be able to have a way for families and all families in Wyoming, not just families who are on child care assistance, but any family that's looking for child care to be able to come, for providers to be able to market themselves through a provider portal, families to be able to come in and say, here's what I'm looking for, here's my needs in childcare. I also might need help with assistance. Can you give me an idea as to whether or not I could qualify? And if I do, what does that look like from a provider perspective, and what could I be eligible for? What providers are in my community that are going to be able to meet my needs? And that way, families and providers are able to connect, real time, to be able to have an exchange, set up tours, and really be able to help families find care when they need it, where they need it, and in a really streamlined way. This is also where we're going to be creating a lot of efficiency through our child care assistant payment process. You may remember that I mentioned last year we used carbon copy for our invoicing, and we want to get out of that practice. And so we are going to be have online payments and online invoicing for our providers to ensure that the focus really stays on the children and not on the administrative processes that they are working through right now. We also have received a consultative grant through the State Capacity Building Center to build a provider toolkit to help providers become licensed and reduce any barriers to becoming licensed within their communities. This is community specific, and the family resource centers that you may be aware of that are going up in communities are going to be the navigators for this toolkit to be able to help interested parties in their communities navigate, different community requirements such as zoning, fire inspections, whatever that might be, to help from a licensing perspective. Additionally, we are working with the Department of Education, the Department of Health, Elliot Regenstein, who is behind me, to set up an early childhood integrated data system. So when we talk about outcomes, when we talk about access and wanting to see who's accessing different programs, right? I showed you the landscape of licensed childcare providers in that capacity, but we know that there's other programs that we're going to be hearing about, and we want to see what the utilization of all of those programs together are. That's what this system is going to be able to do, is to help us look across the entire ECE landscape to be able to identify where services are being accessed and where we need to really grow those services. We are undertaking a really rigorous look at our rules and our requirements from a regulatory perspective. This is a conversation that we're also having with the Joint Labor Health and Social Services Committee about what is required from a regulatory perspective and a licensing perspective. Where can those be loosened? Where can those be negotiated a little bit to, at the end of the day, ensure that we have really strong health and safety for children, but also ensuring that we are being as provider friendly as possible. And then we have a number of collaborative efforts. I mentioned the Family Resource Centers. We are also working really closely with the Wyoming Business Council and the Harvard Growth Lab to do some research about supply and demand of childcare within Wyoming, and really looking at the demand and seeing that there's a high demand for early care and education in the state, but that the supply isn't following that. And through the Harvard Growth Lab, they have interviewed providers from Wyoming and Rock Springs and the Pinedale area to be able to get a better sense as to why that is. that's where we're hearing the workforce constraints conversation as well. And so they've created some policy recommendations for us to take a look at, such as looking at startup funding for childcare providers, looking at how do we provide childcare assistance to childcare workers from an assistance perspective, looking at zoning regulations. So they provided some policy recommendations through their research for us to be able to follow through on and see if we can make an impact from an access perspective. And then the Early Childhood State Advisory Council, which is composed of providers, the Head Start Collaborative, many of my colleagues who are here with me today serve on that council as well. And there's been DFS through the executive order is required to be the coordination arm of that council. But through that council, we've identified 3 priorities that we're working on. One is policy harmonization, so really looking at our programs and our policies across the different state agencies and seeing where there's areas that we can work more collaboratively together. Where can we leverage funding or braid funding potentially? Where are we duplicating efforts and where can we be more streamlined? Just asking those questions among all of our programs. And really help having the CDCs and the providers help us with that and help us learn what it looks like from a day-to-day perspective for them. Again, we are working with the ECSAC and the Harvard Growth Lab to engage the business community. We know early care and education impacts economic development. That's kind of the crux of why we're working with the Business Council, is to really talk about if you don't have early care and education, then you don't have a workforce, right? And that's shown through really brightly through COVID, right? And so really talking about how do we engage the business community and having these conversations and being creative to assist with the access issue as well. And then the ECSAC also developed a kindergarten transition toolkit for families, for providers, for educators to be able to use to ensure that any curriculum that they do have is really focused on making sure that our youngest youth are successful going into the educational system. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I can hand it over to Department of Workforce Services.
Thank you, Roxanne. Mr. Chairman, again, I am Liz Gagan, and I am the Director of the Department of Workforce Services. And today I'm going to talk with the committee about 2 things. One is information that we asked our Research and Planning Division to put together with regard to the child care workforce. And number 2 is the Y Quality Counts program that the Department of Workforce Services administers. So this first slide that we're looking at was put together by our Research and Planning Division. And what it shows is the average annual wage for a child care worker. We provided this same information last year. And I would like to note that the average annual wage for a child care worker in Wyoming has increased by a little over $2,500 per year. I will also note, if you look at the information about our 7 neighboring states, each of those neighboring states had an increase in the average annual wage for their child care workers as well. However, they were substantially larger. The increases were larger than what we saw in Wyoming. The largest increase was in North Dakota, and that was an increase of $5,100 per year. And then South Dakota was the increase that was closest to Wyoming, but slightly higher at $2,700 a year. I'll also note that Wyoming's overall average wage, the increase there was about $5,800 per year. So that was a substantially larger than the increase for our childcare workforce, which again was about $2,500 per year. Roxanne, next slide. This is also information that was provided by our Research and Planning folks. The information in the table has not changed since last year, but there is a slight change in the short-term occupational projections. When we presented this information last year, the projection was for a negative 0.3% growth, and you'll see that that has increased to 2.3%. And then over the next 2 years, Wyoming is projected to have 445 total openings for childcare workers. And this is a decrease from the information that we gave you last year. So it's a decrease of 63. And of course, I'm not an economist, but I think that that's probably good news. And hopefully there is some, the turnover in childcare is hopefully slowing down a little bit. Roxanne, next slide. And then the next item that I wanted to talk about is why quality counts. Department of Workforce Services administers the Why Quality Counts program. In 2006, the Joint Labor Committee started kind of a large package of legislation regarding quality in childcare. And then in 2007, they made some changes and the program started. And today, what the Why Quality Counts program does is it gives grants for professional education development. So when we have people who are working in childcare centers would like to get some additional training, we are able to provide grants for them to do so. We also provide technical assistance, business management services, and family strengthening programs. And we do this through a contract with the University of Wyoming, specifically the UW's Wyoming Early Childhood Outreach Network. And then we also provide parental education and public awareness. And we do this kind of through a marketing a firm and providing information that way. The biennial standard budget is 1.2 million, with a little more than half going to scholarships and grants, and a little less than half for the family strengthening programs, parental education. And the scholarships is something that I neglected to give you very much information on. We are also able to provide scholarships for people working in childcare, and specifically if they are seeking a degree in early childhood development, we are able to offer up to $1,000 scholarships for those folks. And with that, I stand for any questions, and if there are none, I will turn it over to the Department of Education.
Committee, do you have a question, comment? All right, none appearing.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Committee. Again, I'm Shelley Hamill with the Wyoming Department of Education. And I just want to mention before I dive into my presentation that I'm really grateful this morning for the Family Friend and Neighborhood Daycare Network. I have unexpectedly received my 10-year-old granddaughter, and I can tell you the daycare challenge is real. I could not find anywhere in Laramie that would be able to take her the entire summer. So I can just echo those sentiments from a personal perspective, the challenge that is there. Professionally though, let's dive into our presentation. So this morning, I'm going to share a little bit about the 4 areas, 3 primarily, that the Wyoming Department of Education steps into in the early childhood space. So the first is in the area of special education, or IDEA, for providing funds for children ages 3 through 5 to receive the services that they need. My colleague, Mr. Petrie, is going to dive more deeply into that, so I won't be talking about that so much. He'll take care of that in a moment. But the second way that the WD participates in early childhood space is through receiving the TANF funds, a small portion from the Wyoming Department of Family Services that we then subgrant to organizations to support the enrollment of eligible children in preschool programs. The third way is that the WDE oversees the federal funds, Title I, Part A, and these are distributed to school districts. A school district may choose to use some of its allocation to provide a preschool program. And then the fourth way is the Head Start State Collaboration Office. That is part of the WDE. So if you'll scroll back to slide 21. That's okay. Thank you. All right. As noted, the WDE annually receives a small portion of the overall TANF funds that Wyoming receives. So the purpose of this is to cover costs of enrollment to high-quality preschools for children coming from low-income families. The WDE runs a competitive grant application process to distribute these funds. For the current grant cycle that will come to an end this September, there are 12 preschool settings that receive TANF funds in our state. I want to point out that when we started this 2-year cycle, we had funded 13 sites, but one of them was forced to close. So again, we see that real challenge happening. These TANF sites then, the grant received these funds, and these grant awards range from a low of $53,000 a year to a high of just over $358,000 a year, and support approximately 325 children. So preschool settings that receive the TANF funds must meet certain criteria to ensure that it is a high-quality setting. So they must meet the National Association for Education of Young Children's standards for leadership and management. They must demonstrate the implementation of Wyoming's 2002 early childhood readiness standards. They must ensure that the child enrolled through TANF funds receives a developmental screening. They also must offer child-centered conferences and coordinate monthly community communication or an outreach event. Next slide.
Chairman Scott, please go ahead.
Question, Chairman, question on the TANF preschool funding. It's only a small portion of the total TANF money. Now, these are originally the monies that we got for success in the welfare reform, where, like all the states, we did better than most. We succeeded in reducing the expenditures on the traditional cash grant welfare program, and we got a bonus because of it. What is the other use of those TANF funds? Because my understanding is the legislature could change that if we wanted to.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Chairman Scott, I'll go ahead and take that question if that's okay with you. Since the Department of Family Services oversees the whole TANF block grant, a portion of that goes to the Department of Education. And so Chairman Scott, like you mentioned, there is the cash assistance program that's about $3.2 million as part of the TANF block grant, and that is cash assistance directly to families who are income eligible, searching for work. Also about and this is old data, so it's off the top of my head, but about half of those dollars also go to caretaker relatives, so grandparents who are caring for children, stepping in and taking guardianship in order to help those children and those families be successful. The POWER program, so the program that we our welfare to work program, as it was formerly known, is also a part of our TANF block grant. So there's funding that goes to that to be able to help families find work and be successful. That's a partnership with the Department of Workforce Services to be able to help families find work. And then we also have a number of different contracts with local communities it could be through county commissioners, it could be through local nonprofits to be able to provide really targeted community services for families in need and for families who are income eligible from a TANF perspective. The full table of TANF spending and those programs was provided in a memo last year to this committee. We're happy to provide that information. Again, it hasn't changed. And so if you want us to provide that in another follow-up memo, we can certainly do that.
Yes or no?
No.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, unless we start getting into saying we ought to expand the TANF preschool program, then we'll need to talk about that. But Mr. Chairman, I wanted to feel where that was going so the committee could understand the difficulties if we would encounter, we went down that road.
Correct.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Senator Rothfuss.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. A couple of quick follow-up questions on the TANF funding. First, similar to the previous question, I believe that 18.4 million is a calculated number that we don't have any effect on, so we can't change our programs to influence that number. Is that right?
Mr. Chairman, yes, that's correct.
And second question, Mr. Chairman, getting at Chairman Scott's line of questioning, are there unserved TANF eligible families around the state? So if we had more than $1.8 million dedicated, we would have additional eligible enrollments at the 185% of FPL.
Mr. Chairman, I don't have that precise of data with me. Anecdotally, yes. I think that there is opportunity for the families at a federal poverty level who aren't able to take advantage of TANF preschools or other early care and education programs. But yes, and I can get you some specific numbers on that.
And a quick follow-up with that, Mr. Chairman, I suspect some of that is that we've only got 12 preschools as well. So you probably have those 12 preschools at capacity and people wanting to get in, and then you would want more preschools. So we probably have both sides of supply. Is that right?
Mr. Chairman, yes, that's correct.
Thank you.
Further questions while we're stopped? All right, please proceed, Wanda.
All right, we'll resume then. With Title I, Part A federal funds, they are similar in their purpose to the TANF funds that I just described, in that the funds should supplement educational programs and services for disadvantaged children in high poverty schools. So the intent is to ensure that all children have a significant opportunity to receive a fair, equitable, and a high-quality education, and to close the educational achievement gaps. So school districts receive this funding based on the number of children that are in or that are at or below the poverty level for the federal government's definition of poverty. So I think we are all aware that there is a high correlation between lack of achievement and poverty. So once the district then receives the allocation, it determines which of its schools within the district are highest poverty and will receive the funds, or if those will be school-wide programs, or if the program will actually impact district-wide. So the important part of our discussion, though, here this morning is that one allowable use of the Title I Part A funds is to provide preschool opportunities as a way to intervene early with children who are deemed at risk. So this school year, there were 12 districts that offered preschool opportunities using a portion of their Title I funds. And they report that that investment was just over $3 million. Title I can play a big part in providing that enhanced early childhood services because of the flexibility in Title I funds. Funds can be used to improve the quality of early childhood by providing professional development for early childhood providers, extending the length of the hours that the preschool might operate. It can increase the number of days, or it can increase the number of children served in Head Start or other community-based early learning programs. So I'd like to share, we just completed, the WD hosted our annual STAR conference, which is a conference for educators utilizing federal funds. And at that conference, we highlighted one school district that was using their Title I funds to help support a preschool, and that was Fremont County School District number 25. During that presentation, they shared that they tried to maximize the funding impact by utilizing those funds with others to help with some staffing needs, some professional development, to actually purchase program resources, and then to even offset a little bit of the cost of the facility itself. They reported that these funds support not only children in their district that are at the poverty level, but other at-risk students, such as those identified as a child with a disability, and English language learner children, and students experiencing homelessness. They utilize a model that uses a preschool liaison that collaborates between the teachers, school district personnel, preschools, and daycares in the community. The liaison provides current information to daycares, centers, and preschools about early childhood education, and even meets monthly and reviews early learning standards and developmentally appropriate practices. Fremont 25 also uses some of this funding to engage families through engagement nights that support the initiatives around their preschool programs. This was a quote from them. "By involving families in our children's education and development, we ensure that students receive consistent support and encouragement both at home and in school." They were also really proud that they had developed partnerships with early learning programs such as the Child Development Services, which is their local CDC, and Head Start to create a seamless transition into kindergarten. These partnerships involve sharing resources, coordinating services, and aligning curriculum and evaluations to ensure a smooth transition for children entering kindergarten. So, before the relocation of the Head Start State Collaboration Office to the WD a couple of years ago, I knew very little about its function. And I think you might be surprised as well. There is no direct oversight from that state collaboration office or supervision of local early Head Start or Head Start programs. Each of these programs is funded and monitored directly from the federal Office of Head Start. So I found that a little bit surprising. But the word collaboration in the title, so the Head Start State Collaboration Office really says it all. The primary function of this position then is to facilitate collaboration and partnerships between entities to better support the needs of low-income families with children whose ages range from birth to 5. The individual in this position is involved in various state initiatives and policy development that focus on improved systems for support. And as a side note, there is a really strong Head Start presence in our state. For the current year, which is typical, there are 47 Head Start or early Head Start centers statewide. And they typically serve 2,000, the Head Starts typically serve 2,000 Wyoming children and families each year. And an additional 500 families enroll annually in the early Head Start programs.
Interrupt you for just a minute. Senator Scott, Chairman Scott has a question, a comment.
Back on the correlation between poverty and success in education. And Matt, Wilmarth, correct me if I'm misstating here. We looked at that in the context of success in reading as measured at the third grade level by the YTOP. We looked at that at the last year before the COVID epidemic hit. And we found a substantial correlation, but it wasn't as high as I thought it would be. My memory is the correlation between poverty as measured by the free and reduced lunch and the performance of the school districts in getting kids into the proficient and advanced categories or out of the basic and below basic categories, whichever way you want to look at it. We found a correlation, my memory is it was 0.46. So significant, but not overwhelming. And we also found that the more successful school districts were able to take the kids that were in that free and reduced lunch category, which we do record separately on our reporting our assessment testing, and get them to where they were performing better than the statewide average for all kids. So is there other evidence that suggests that the correlation is stronger than that? Or is that, how strong really is that correlation?
Go ahead, Wanda.
Shelley, Mr. Chairman. Senator Scott, I think that national statistics nationally would suggest that there's a very high correlation. I think that what the data would suggest that you and Mr. Wilmarth worked on would be a testament to the efforts of the local school districts and educators. And I think that they would be best positioned to speak to that. I would be happy to find national statistics for you around that poverty correlation if you'd be interested.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
the point I would like to make, I'm not sure how relevant the national figures are to Wyoming. We lack some of the features like a big inner city that some other states would have. The point I'd like to make is that there clearly is a correlation. It's not, in Wyoming, it hasn't been, I think, quite as high, Mr. Chairman. And I think it's a testimony to some of our better districts that the district can overcome that.
Okay, so we have another question by Representative Lawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Shelley, do you have any of the information, again, I know this Head Start's a federally managed program, but about the issue of access, about any idea about how many children in Wyoming would be eligible for Head Start, but there is no space for them with the facilities in their particular areas of Wyoming? What's the access, or do you know? And is the new thing that you're creating, is Head Start going to be a part of that in any way, or is it only things that regard state-run programs? I'm talking about the software program that's going to kind of talk about access issues. Can you kind of address both those?
Go ahead, Shelley.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Lawley, I think I can just speak to, at the WD, we don't have any numbers to quantify the number of children that might qualify for a Head Start spot that are not available. And speaking about the e-care system, I'm going to share that back over to Roxanne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Representative Lawley. The eKids system, so we have lots of systems. So the eKids system is our integrated system among different programs. And yes, the Head Start Collaborative is a part of eKids. We're working to right now bring the data from a federal perspective, so get data that is more child specific to be able to get to more of the answer on access and who would be eligible versus right now we have the federal data that's reported through the federal requirements, and that's what's used in eKids right now. Again, working really hard to make sure that we get the child level data to be able to have more Wyoming specific numbers on access and opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I think that was part of what I was getting at. Are you getting reports on Head Start that help you understand who's eligible versus access from the, I know you don't keep those statistics, you can't measure them, but just trying to get a beat, because I believe in my district that is an issue, that there are kids that are eligible on waiting lists that are not being able to access that Head Start program, so that they're eligible, but it's again an access issue. But I'm wondering how big that is in the state in general, or is it just more rural districts, things like that? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, that's something that I can follow up with. I can reach out to Head Start, the collaboration, and find out some numbers, because I think they'd be best. They could confirm that.
Thank you. We have one question online. Go ahead, Representative Clauston.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question to the panel. What is the percentage of poverty level to qualify for the Early Head Start program?
I'm
Mr.
sorry, I did
Chairman.
it against Shelley.
It's all right. Mr. Chairman, I don't know what that threshold is. I don't work directly with the Head Start qualification. But again, I can find that out as well and provide that report with the gap in services that you asked about.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. Please proceed, Shelley.
All right, we'll move on to slide 24. And we're going to talk just a moment here about kindergarten readiness. It loosely connects with this morning's topic of early childhood governance, but it was requested by the committee. So the statute that identifies the minimum age requirements for entering kindergarten and first grade is Wyoming Statute 214302, specifically Section E. And it requires districts providing a preschool program to assess through the fourth grade when practical, the school readiness and academic performance of students who participated in the district's preschool program compared to those children that did not participate in the district's preschool program. And up until 2019, when that requirement was removed, districts were required to report this information to the WDE through a data collection. At this point, districts are required to have the data available for review only if it's requested. So kindergarten readiness assessments are used across the country and in our state. There are many commercially available, and these vary in what skills they assess and in quality, as you could imagine. The 6 most commonly used nationally are Teaching Strategies Gold, the Desired Results Developmental Profile Kindergarten, the Work Sampling System, the Maryland, Ohio Kindergarten Readiness Assessment, the Brigance Early Childhood Screens, and then STAR Early Literacy. And each, like I mentioned before, evaluates a range of what they consider essential domains. We see these used across our state in varying numbers. And again, I want to point out that while there is no common definition or criteria in Wyoming to identify kindergarten readiness, most school districts engage in some form of evaluation to determine readiness levels of students entering its district for kindergarten. So the WDE provided a survey this past May to school districts to better understand kindergarten readiness assessment and practices across the state. I'm pleased to report that we had a 73% response rate to the survey, which is really high. I'm really grateful to the districts for responding. The information that we collected indicated that the majority of districts that responded, 16 of those use a district-developed kindergarten readiness assessment. Of those 16, 10 of those also use that in conjunction with a commercially available product. The Brigance was the most commonly reported commercially available KRA used in our state. So then districts also identified common domains that they felt were important to evaluate for readiness upon entering kindergarten. 34 districts identified that they look for language and literacy development. 31 identified that they evaluate for cognition and general knowledge. 25 look for physical well-being and motor development. And 21 additionally look for markers of social and emotional development. Those high numbers are in contrast to just a few districts reporting evaluating children for approaches to learning or self-help type characteristics. Responding districts also identified that their most common uses of kindergarten readiness for the assessment results were with 31 districts identifying this as their top: engage families by providing information about their students' skill set. 30 districts also said that they use this information to inform curriculum and instruction decisions to address individual students' learning needs. Delaying kindergarten was on the survey as an option, and that was the least identified use of the kindergarten readiness assessment, with only 14 districts identifying that they consider that. Districts did report a variety of kindergarten preparation type programs as well. Some of these include year-long preschools, and then most commonly were summer opportunities before the kindergarten school year began. While they're called by different names, we did have 8 districts report some sort of year-long pre-kindergarten program. At the completion of the presentation by the 5 different state organizations, you'll be able to hear from some school districts specifically about the programs that they offer. Some are here in person to present and share, and I think that there will be at least one that will be sharing virtually. So with that, I'll stand for any questions before I toss it to my colleague, Mr. Petrie.
Go ahead, Chairman Scott.
One of the questions that you raised at the outset of the presentation was that there isn't a statewide definition of kindergarten readiness. And I can see a legislative use for such a definition. Question for the State Department of Education. What do you recommend as a definition of kindergarten readiness?
Go ahead, please.
Mr. Chairman and Senator Scott, I think that instead of trying to answer that right off the cuff, that it would be valuable to take some time, work with school districts to identify what they see as most relevant, and be able to bring a definition back to the committee if you're interested in that.
Go ahead, Senator Scott.
So you don't, and I'm looking at Mr. Shaner in part, you don't have it at this point, a recommended definition. Is that my understanding?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, through you, Co-Chairman Scott, Dickey Shaner, Department of Ed. One thing that may help address this is later today, we're talking about the ESA program. And in that bill, we actually have to come up with some kindergarten readiness standards. And so we're putting together a working group to really look at that for the ESA purposes. And then that could certainly scale out on a larger scale if needed. But so that discussion will happen in relation to the ESA legislation.
Go ahead. Follow.
Let me explain part of my interest. The presentation material and the comments and the lack of definition of what a preschool was and what kindergarten readiness was really piqued my interest. I thought that the department had hit on a couple of key issues there, Mr. Chairman. And it looks to me like I keep hearing that preschool can be a real key to improving our success in teaching kids how to read. And Mr. Chairman, we have problems funding that. And I think some of the TANF discussion highlighted that, but we also have problems because of the way our state constitution is written, where we would then be expanding if we tried to fund preschools on a large scale. And I think we might have difficulty selling that. One of the possibilities is to say to the, DFS is licensing large number of childcare providers. We don't want to in any way decrease those numbers because they're needed. But if we were to say, Mr. Chairman, that they couldn't call themselves preschools unless they were preschools, and that they had to have curriculums or programs that were designed to produce kindergarten readiness, then they could call themselves a preschool and use that as a marketing technique. Same way, and we act in some of the licensure bills. You have to be one to say that you are one. And so we would need a definition of kindergarten readiness for that purpose. And Mr. Chairman, that's where my concern is. And I think we need to work on legislation in that. So, Mr. Chairman, may come with something that's a plug definition that we'll have to amend.
Yes, and I think along with that comes curriculum too, so.
Yeah.
Do you have a comment? Go ahead, Representative Lawley.
Yeah, again, to just say, to your point, Dickey, about we're working in conjunction with the ESA on developing that. And do you feel like that once that's developed, it would be good to have some legislation and some enforcement, so there is clarity for the department, for parents about when childcare is happening and when preschool education is happening. Is that helpful, do you think?
Good.
Mr. Chairman, through you, Representative Lawley, I think it's a timely discussion because of the ESA bill. I think that the ESA bill work will be pretty specific to the ESA program. And if there's a larger discussion, if these are, some of the main players and the stakeholders in the pre-K community would really need to be engaged with that purpose. But I do think it's timely in the fact that we are looking at it with the ESA bill.
Comments? Anybody? All right, we'll move on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, my name is Matt Petrie. I'm the Senior Administrator of the Behavioral Health Division for the Department of Health. The Early Intervention and Education Program is one of 4 major programs in the Behavioral Health Division. We manage the program in collaboration with the Department of Education. If we look at slide number 26, really what this does is it gives us just the statutory basis for the program itself. Federal legislation, of course. And what this ensures is that it guarantees access to a free and appropriate public education to children with disabilities. So the Early Intervention and Education Program in the state of Wyoming does truly serve children with developmental delays. 2 parts to the program. You can see here the second bullet point on slide 26. Part C is a part of the program which is not mandated by the federal government. It is optional for states. All 50 states have opted in to provide Part C services. Part C services are primarily delivered in a home setting, and it's for children birth through age 2. Again, children identified with developmental delays. As children transition out of Part C, if they're still in need of services, they move into Part B. Again, this is the portion of the program that is mandated by the federal government. It serves children ages 3 through 21. And I think a distinction that's important here, and we'll touch on this a little bit later, is that Part C, federal funding for Part C comes directly to the Department of Health. Federal funding for Part B comes to the Department of Education and is then passed through to the Department of Health. If you look at our budget, you will see the federal funding for Part C in our budget tables. If you're looking for the federal funding that comes to the Department of Health for Part B, it actually shows up as other revenue. Again, if we move to slide 27, the Early Intervention Education Program manages the Part C program. As I just indicated, those federal funds come directly to us. Part B, 619, again, administered by the Department of Health, but overseen by the Department of Education. You can think of the EIE program as essentially the 49th school district, if you will, or the 49th LEA in the state of Wyoming, in addition to the 48 K-12 districts.
Go ahead, Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Matt, just a quick question for you on this. I've been dealing with this for 8 years now, and the discussion is pretty much the same thing as it always is. What type of discussions do you have, and maybe not you personally, but some of your team members, on when you guys get a question about the program? How often do you guys get those calls and say, well, you've got to call the Department of Education to have that discussion? They're actually the overseers of it, or vice versa. They call you and you guys have the answer. I guess maybe a different way, what I'm trying to ask is it tough for providers to know the difference between who is overseeing versus who is managing the grants? And also on top of that, what type of federal strings are attached to these programs?
Go ahead, Mr. Petrie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown. I think that at a high level, the questions on a daily basis, operational aspects of the child development centers are certainly handled by the Department of Health and our staff of 4 in the early intervention and education program. When we come to issues of compliance, and especially federal compliance, certainly the Department of Education governs there, and that is a large part of their oversight role for especially Part B. If we have, say, a complaint by a parent for services provided to their child, typically those will start, if you will, at the Department of Education, but then we work with them collaboratively to work through that. Those compliance issues are relatively strict, relatively, I don't want to say burdensome, but the federal government essentially requires 100% compliance. So if we have an individual, we have one of our child development centers where there is a compliance question or a concern raised, the system as a whole, it's looked at holistically. Because we are one LEA, although we have 14 child development centers, we're considered one district. And so in situations like that, addressing concerns or questions of that type are really dealt with holistically. But we do work extensively with the Department of Education in resolving those. You're welcome.
Go ahead, Chairman Scott.
Following up on that, am I right in thinking a good deal of the compliance when it comes to how individual children are treated and their individual education program? I think that's still the term that's used there. That gets enforced through the court system, does it not? Because am I not right in thinking that there is extensive ability under the federal law for the parents to sue?
Go ahead, Matt.
Mr. Chairman, I think that option is certainly available for parents. Typically complaints, though, however, concerns, questions raised by family members follow a less formal procedure. We really try to work through those concerns with the Department of Education, again, in a collaborative way to address those concerns of those parents or of the programs prior to anything like a lawsuit being filed by parents.
Okay, further questions? Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, looking at slide number 27, our second bullet point there, just to reiterate that there is a memorandum of understanding that really sets out the collaboration and the way that the Department of Health works with the Department of Education for Part B. Again, Part C, essentially because that federal funding comes straight to the Department of Health, program eligibility is set forth in our Chapter 8 rules. But again, because Part B, federal funding comes straight to the Department of Education, that is set out in Department of Education Chapter 7 rules. We contract with the child development centers around the state of Wyoming. There are 14 regions. And really what we do here, we contract with these child development centers on an annual basis. What we do is we issue an RFA, request for applications, on an annual basis. Certainly a number of criteria that child development centers have to meet in order to be eligible to apply. One of the stipulations currently for application and consideration for an award of contract is that a center provide both Part C and Part B services, so that, and I think the intent there is to minimize the number of transitions that children and their families experience moving through Part C into Part B if the child still needs those types of services. So that is, again, a process that we go through annually. We contract with the child development centers annually. If we move to slide 28, what we see here is just a very high level org chart or flow chart, if you will. Again, touching on a number of the things that we've already spoken to. You can see at the top of the table there, IDEA governs birth through age 21 supports for children with disabilities. That is, of course, carried out formally by the Department of Education as the state education agency. And then excuse me, as we move down the chart, the WDE through IDEA delegates service provision to local education agencies. And again, as I mentioned before, that is for not only the 48 K-12 school districts, but also the early intervention and education program, again, is technically the 49th school district. Part C, again, early intervention services for children ages 0 through 2. If they still need those services, they transition into Part B, 619, and that serves children ages 3 through 5, really attempting to prepare these children for entry into the K-12 system. Again, our agency early intervention education program in the Behavioral Health Division contracts with those 14 regional child development centers to carry out both Part C and Part B aspects of the program. And once more, just to reiterate that as it stands now, our request for applications requires that CDCs agree to provide both Part C and Part B services. If we move to slide number 29, really just a pictorial of the child development centers themselves and the counties that they serve. You can see that it's color-coded, makes it pretty easy to look at. You can see that we have some counties or some CDCs that serve as little as 1 county. We have other CDCs that serve a number of counties. As you can see on the map, Region 1 serves 3 counties.
Second, we have a question.
Yes.
Go ahead, Representative Lawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just wondering on the terms of the contract, how long do you contract when you contract with the CDC? Is there a specific term?
Go ahead, Matt.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Lawley, the contracts are on an annual basis. They run with, concurrent with the fiscal year. So we will have a new contract that starts July 1st of 2024, runs through June 30th of 2025.
Thank you.
Please continue.
Thank you. Slide 30, current funding, both state and federal. As you know, as members of the legislature, we had a couple of bills in this last session that I think were certainly beneficial to the system to a very large degree. We ran into a bit of a unique situation where we had bills that essentially made an appropriation. There was, of course, a standalone bill, which was Senate Enrolled Act number 56, that carried an appropriation of about $16.4 million. There was also an appropriation amount in the budget itself that called for a $12.3 million exceptional request for funding. These are essentially, and just to give you a little bit of background on these, there was in Senate Enrolled Act number 56, we had worked basically with Legislative Service Office to take a look at the way that we calculate exception requests for the child development centers. So statutorily, we are required every year to bring a request for external cost adjustment. We are also statutorily required to bring an exception request for a change in the child count in the system. Historically, that external cost adjustment for the CDCs has relied on one cost index, one of 4 used by the basically by the K-12 system, and that was for educational materials and supplies. So what we have seen over the years is that our external cost adjustment has been based solely on that one index, and you can see relatively wide swings in that index just depending on, again, the costs of educational supplies and materials. The proposal in Senate Enrolled Act number 56 was to use the same cost indices as the K-12 system, which much better reflects the true costs that are incurred by the child development centers. And so that passed. But basically what that did was it looked back to 2008 and said, if we were using this methodology since 2008, what would our request look like? How much would we be asking the legislature for in terms of an external cost adjustment? That number is that $12.2 million number. During a meeting of this body last year, there was, when Senate Enrolled Act number 56 was crafted, there was a question raised about what type of funding, what level of funding was needed by the child development centers to appropriately fund the services they provide to children and families. On a per child basis, that number was $12,300. When you basically do the math, you take that $12,300 per child, multiply it out by the number of children served. That's how you arrive at the $16.4 million figure. Again, the budget bill itself, really the $12.3 million that was requested in the budget bill tied very closely to the methodology that was basically reviewed and constructed by us in coordination with the Legislative Service Office. Ultimately, that difference in funding amounts, appropriated amounts, was resolved. The $12.2 million or $12.3 million was what actually will go to the CDCs for this biennium. The other thing that I need to explain is that anytime that we receive an ECA for the CDCs, it's considered a biennial appropriation. And so we split it because we contract on an annual basis. We split it right down the middle. For this upcoming biennium, half of it will go into fiscal year 25, the other half will go into fiscal year 26. When we come back, as we're statutorily required to, midway through the biennium, during the supplemental session, we will again ask for an external cost adjustment and also an appropriation for any growth in the child count. If there is an appropriation made at mid-biennium, we again are obligated to split that appropriation between the two fiscal years that fall in the biennium. So just a bit of history there in terms of where we are today. The $12.3 million appropriation is certainly incredibly welcome by the CDCs and gets us much closer to that $12,300 base amount. Again, I think it's important to note that what we had in state statute prior to the legislative session was there was a base amount that we were required to fund per child. And if you look at a slide, excuse me, if you look at slide 30, the bullet point there, that very first bullet point, 8,866, is what that minimum sat at prior to Senate Enrolled Act 56. It is now $12,300 per child. So when we come to the legislature in the supplemental session, our request will be based upon that $12,300 per child, plus any external cost adjustment due, for the current year. Again, using the four same indices that are used for the K-12 system. So that's just I hope an understandable description of the mechanics of how the appropriations work today.
I have a question from Representative Brown. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Matt, I just want to make sure we're explicitly clear here that the external cost adjustment is something that we have set in statute that requires you to go back, talk with everybody, and come to us with a recommendation of what it costs for these CDCs to provide their services across the state to all 23 counties. Is that correct?
But
Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, yes and no. Because we use established indices, the external cost adjustment is based upon those. And so there aren't any formalized discussions with the CDCs where, say, we would examine their books to see what their true costs are for provision of services. And as you can imagine, with 14 CDCs, you're going to have some variation there, and in fact, quite a bit of variation. And so really what we do is I think the intent was to move away from the one index where you could see relatively wild swings, both up and down, to 4 indices that really, again, are much more representative of the actual costs that the CDCs incur. So you've got an index for professional staff, you've got an index for support staff, you've got an index for utilities. So again, I think that the rationale behind the legislation was to provide a much more representative external cost adjustment that would be used to consider increased funding than the one that we had used previously. We, of course, get those indexes or indices from the Department of Education.
Go ahead, follow up.
Just a curiosity out of that, if these indices ever go negative, we have an MOE, maintenance of effort requirement, that we would never drop below what our statutory requirement of that 12,300 is required, correct?
Go ahead, Matt.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, again, yes and no. Right now, the statutory requirement is $12,300 per child. Our current funding level is below that. And you'll see a little bit further in my presentation that there is a table that shows appropriations that have been made over the years for external cost adjustments. I think it's important to note that while we are statutorily required to bring a request for an external cost adjustment, the legislature has the authority to determine the amount of the appropriation. Some years certainly have been better than others for the CDCs, but the legislature, of course, has the authority to make that appropriation. If I may, however, I'd like to touch on the maintenance of effort requirement that you mentioned. Maintenance of effort is incredibly important because really what we find ourselves in is a situation typical to a lot of types of federal funding, where once you've set the bar, you must maintain that bar in the future. So basically, when we have a level of funding, a per child level of funding, you need to maintain that, because if we drop below that, if the state appropriation drops below that same proportion to the federal appropriation, then we can find ourselves in violation of MOE.
Thank you. Please proceed.
Thank you. We look at slide 31. This table really just gives you an idea of what I just described. Keep in mind that this is just 1/2 of the biennium, so it's for the upcoming fiscal year, July of 24 through June of 25. And so what you see here is essentially half of our biennial appropriation in the lower right-hand corner there, that $40 million. But you can see that where we started in that first numeric column entitled State General Fund Standard, you can see where we started with our Part C funding for next fiscal year, as well as our Part D funding. And then you can see of the $12.3 million that was received as an external cost adjustment, again, we split that in half, so $6 million per year. Of that $6 million, $2 million goes to Part B, $4 million, or excuse me, $2 million goes to Part C, $4 million goes to Part B. You can also see our federal funds, which quite frankly have not changed dramatically for quite some time, added in, and then we've got grand totals for the year in the far right-hand numeric column. This also, I think, illustrates the level of state funding for the program in comparison to federal funding. If we move to slide number 32, this touches a little bit on the way that we calculate potential increases in funding requests for additional children being served by the system. So as it stands today, what we do is we take a child count on December 1st of each year. This last year, December 1st of 2023, we took a child count, and then we based an exception request for an increase in that child count. And it was considered in this last legislative session, the 2024 session. That funding then, if appropriated, is available to the child development centers for fiscal year 25 and 26. You may be familiar with the fact that what we do in our budget is we put a placeholder as an exception request. we essentially say, we think this is what the child counts are going to look like for December 1st, but we don't know because obviously we're putting our budget together well ahead of December 1st. So you'll typically see a governor's letter that will come to you at the beginning of the session that says, here's what the child counts were actually on December 1st. And so here is the actual number that needs to be considered for that, that additional appropriation. What Senate Enrolled Act 56 did was it essentially changed that child count date from December 1st to May 1st, which I think is certainly beneficial for the child development centers. I think that they would agree on that. It also gives us the ability to put it into our budget like any other exception request. It's there when the budget is released by the governor's office. There's not a governor's letter that follows it later. The only potential downside to a May 1st versus December 1st child count is you've got a larger lag in time between when the count is taken and when the appropriation corresponding to that count is considered. All in all, though, I think that May 1st is certainly a preferential date as compared to December 1st. So another very good aspect of Senate Enrolled Act 56. Again, the mathematical equation for it, very, very simple. We really just look at the number of children. If we have an increase in children that are being served by the system, comparing one child count date to the previous child count date from the previous year, we really just multiply that out by the per child funding, and that gives us the amount of the appropriation that we request. If we move to slide number 33, this is the table that I mentioned earlier in response to Representative Brown's question. This gives you kind of a historical perspective on requests that have been made and what has been funded each year as we're statutorily required to ask for external cost adjustments. Again, you can see if you look at the column entitled ECA and MOE requested and ECA and MOE approved, you can see the differences that depict what we ask for and what has been appropriated by the legislature. I think there's one very important distinction here, and it is essentially external cost adjustments are cumulative over time. So say, for example, let's just look at the row labeled 2023. Again, we were statutorily required to make an ask of a little bit over $11 million using that one inflationary index. The legislature appropriated $4 million. So then when we come back the following year, what we do is we take that $7 million that was not funded in 2023, we ask for that again. And we ask for the external cost adjustment for the most recent year. So again, it's the way that it's laid out in statute, it's cumulative, and we're obligated to come and ask for that funding to make them whole, if you will, each year.
Senator Rothfuss, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So will you be carrying that to the supplemental request as well, that $4 million that is the balance between what we appropriated versus what we had as the true ECA request?
Go ahead, Matt.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, again, yes and no. The $12,300 per child will basically set the floor for our ask. And then we will, what we will do, of course, is ask for the external cost adjustment on top of that $12,300 for the most recent year. My guess is that ask would exceed what we would typically ask for, the $16 million that was referenced in Senate Enrolled Act 56 versus the appropriation that we received.
And Mr. Chairman, that would then be also based on the May 1 counts for the next time you make the ask. Is that accurate?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, that is accurate.
Okay, thank you. You bet.
Go ahead, Representative Obermueller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to reiterate, I'm sure you've covered this, but I'm trying to work the numbers. So how do you currently reconcile then the 12.3 to the $12 million appropriation. How do you work out those, that gap in terms of the funding currently? What do you do with those? The lack of funding to that 12.3 times the number of individuals out there, number of students.
Go ahead, Matt.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Obermueller, really, we just do it proportionally. So what we do is we recognize that we have a statutory minimum of $12,300. That is what we're statutorily required to fund each child at. But if the appropriation does not support that level of per child funding, then really what we do is we just ratchet it down proportionally. Each of the CDCs will receive the same amount of per child funding for the children they serve, but obviously it's going to be below that $12,300.
Senator Steinmetz, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just to make sure I understand, so in the supplemental budget, you'll be coming for another external cost adjustment, or would it be the next budget? That's my first question. And then because we appropriated the 12 rather than the 16, is the $4 million your base, and then you'll add to that?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Steinmetz, we will be back at the supplemental session to request an external cost adjustment. We're still obligated to do that by statute on an annual basis. The only difference being that, again, that external cost adjustment will be based on 4 indices, similar to those used by the K-12 system, rather than just the one that we have used historically. The $12,300 that's set per child is the base. And had that been funded for the upcoming biennium, it would have resulted in that $6 million request. So in effect, what we do when we come into the next budget cycle and we make our exception request, what we will do is we will ask for that $12,300 base per child, and then any external cost adjustment that is applicable to the most recent year.
Okay, thank you.
And if I may, Mr. Chairman, Senator Steinmetz, keep in mind that typically the way that we handle external cost adjustments, so we calculate the external cost adjustment, again, using the index provided to us by the Department of Education. That's what generates our external cost adjustment. If it is not fully funded by the legislature, then basically we are carrying that unfunded amount forward. In the case of Senate Enrolled Act 56, that was not an external cost adjustment that was calculated by us. It was essentially what was corresponded to the $12,300 figure. And so that is the difference between the process that we typically follow versus this last year, where we had essentially 2 different competing appropriations for the external cost adjustment.
Follow up?
Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So are we at a deficiency now, or did we hit the target of what you were looking for last session? Did we meet the external cost adjustment that you requested, or is there an outstanding balance that will be cumulative in the next session?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Steinmetz, we did not. The request that we made for the external cost adjustment for this session, keep in mind that it carried forward $7 million worth of unfunded cost adjustment from the previous year. To that, we added what was necessary from the most recent external cost adjustment. So it was not funded. The $12.2 million figure is what we worked with LSO on to establish using the 4 indices. So I think it's a matter of perspective, if you will, whether what we asked for was funded or not. We worked with LSO in establishing the use of 4 cost indices as opposed to 1. And that was what the $12.3 million figure resulted in.
So what is the deficit that you're coming in with that you don't feel we funded?
Mr. Chairman, the deficit technically would be the difference between what we are currently funding children at, the per child amount, and the $12,300 that's established in Senate Enrolled Act 56. Keeping in mind that that figure was established during the 2024 session, and so that there would be an external cost adjustment that would load on top of that for FY26.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
I believe Matt has a comment. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Senator Steinitz. I think Mr. Petrie just touched on it, but I'll maybe rephrase it in another way to hopefully make some clarity here. Last year, the legislature reestablished the base amount in statute at $12,300. The additional appropriation in the budget bill and Senate File 19 totaled $12,300,000. That is insufficient to provide a $12,300 per child amount. So Mr. Petrie's answer is twofold. He will request within the budget the amount to buttress his budget to provide the statutory minimum of $12,300. Then the department is also required to, by law, adjust that $12,300 amount by the external cost adjustment provided to school districts for this next school year. So the exception request will be the amount necessary to provide at least the $12,300 plus the ECA that was enacted by the legislature. Additionally, the legislature provided, I think this was a Senate amendment, provided that in the event the appropriation from the legislature is insufficient, the Department of Health is required to prorate the per child amounts to the appropriation level. And that's what they have done for years. It's just formalized through a statutory mechanism now. And so that's kind of the two requests that the department will come to. One, to get back up to the statutory minimum, but then two, to get back up to that statutory minimum ECA'd.
Go ahead and finish it up.
All right, slide number 34. This just gives you an idea of our child count for the 2025 contract, which starts July 1st. You can see them separated between Part B and Part C, and then a grand total in the lower right-hand corner. And then they're also separated out by each of the 14 regions, again, by both children served under Part C and Part B.
Question on these numbers. We've really started talking about two different groups of children here. One is all the children in these age groups, and we're concerned about their readiness for kindergarten, their readiness to learn how to read, and we're trying to improve their readiness to learn how to read. You've got a specialized group which have developmental disabilities. Those are the children that potentially might go into the school's special education counts. And so it's a much lesser number. What of this figure here, are all those kids ones with disabilities, or do some of the CDCs have classrooms with normal kids in them so you can mix them? And do all these kids have disabilities? One point that you're trying to resolve, and what percentage of the total kids in these age groups are we seeing here?
Go ahead, Matt.
Mr. Chairman, the numbers that you see reflected on this table are those children with developmental delays. The child development centers are required to serve those children in an environment with what we call typically developing peers. So children without developmental delays. And that's part of the process in acclimating them, if you will, for the K-12 system.
But those numbers are not in this.
Mr. Chairman, they are not. We could get those numbers for you. We typically, it's a dynamic number. You need to try to provide services to the developmentally delayed children, again, in an atmosphere that includes, just as a rough number, at least 50% typically developing peers. But that number can change. Those percentages can change from center to center. But yes, what you see here are only those children that are funded by the state. The child development centers are certainly allowed to charge tuition for those children that are in the program that are sitting along with the developmentally delayed children and receive funding for them like a preschool would.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
Your total 3,443 that I see at the bottom of this chart, what percentage of the total cohort in this age groups does that represent? Do you know?
Mr. Chairman, I do not, but we can certainly get that number to you. So just to clarify, what you were looking for is total children served in the CDCs and what this 3,400, what percentage that is of the total?
No, Mr. Chairman. What I'm looking for is of the total age cohort that we have living in the state out there. My sense is that this is somewhere in the 10 to 20% of the total age cohort. Is that right, or is it radically different than that?
Right, Matt.
Again, Mr. Chairman, I don't know the answer to that question, but we can certainly get that for you.
Okay.
Representative Lawley has a question, then we'll move to Representative Provenza.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Matt. And this may have been what Chairman Scott was asking as well, but I really want to focus on, again, capacity. What do we know about how many kids are qualified for these programs, but the CDC doesn't have the resources to serve all of them? I'm obviously particularly interested in Region 1 because that's my district. And so I just would want to know that we have the capacity to reach all the children that qualify through the CDCs. And I just don't have a good sense of that. I have heard anecdotally that maybe they may not be able to in Region 1 meet everyone, but I don't know that to necessarily be true. So that's what I'm looking for.
Go ahead, Matt.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Lawley, we are required to serve all children that are identified in need of these types of services. The requirement that the CDCs obviously have a limited amount, especially under Part B, they have a limited amount of floor space, if you will. And when they're licensed by the Department of Family Services, there is a minimum standard. So each child served in a facility, a brick and mortar facility like that, is required. There's a required amount of square footage. So they have a limited capacity to serve children in those brick and mortar facilities. And keep in mind that they must also, by federal statute, federal law, they must also serve typically developing peers. So you're going to have this mixture of developmentally delayed children and typically developing peers. Now, if there are some children that can't be served in that brick and mortar facility, that does not eliminate the requirement to serve them. They must still be served, and they can be served in the community. But that also still obligates the Child Development Center to pay for those services provided at a community provider. And so what you see is you will see a reimbursement of costs for those developmentally delayed children that are served in a preschool, not in the in the CDC itself. And so that's another cost that's incurred by the CDCs, is they must reimburse preschools for services provided in the community. But again, the children that are identified as requiring services under the program must be served in some setting.
Go ahead, Paula.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So again, do you know the percentage of these, I think they're often referred to as PACER kids or kids that are in their, the program that aren't really the target, but they're part of the process of helping serve these kids. Is there a certain percentage they're required to have? That's my first follow-up. And the second one has to do with, I think that's the issue I've heard in my district, is that because of that, for example, possibly using even some other programs out there, but not being served by the CDC. And so anyway, I just want to know a little bit more about that, that dynamic and how it works.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, Representative Lawley, I think it differs from CDC and from community and region served to any other region served. You certainly, what you'll find is around the state, you have some communities, and I think we saw it in the presentation by Ms. Hamill, that what you have is you have, some communities that quite simply have more preschools available in their communities. So it's tough to pinpoint a percentage of typically developing peers that must be served in a CDC. A rule of thumb is that a majority of children must be served in a CDC that are typically developing peers, those children without developmental delays. But again, that number can vary from CDC and from community to community, just depending on the dynamics of the community. But really what you want to do is you want to serve these children in an environment that's most beneficial to them, and letting them take advantage, quite frankly, of being taught, being treated, being cared for in an environment where they are with typically developing peers. So that percentage can vary, and we've seen that, and there's certainly debate about that. I don't think that even at the federal level there is a standard, if you will, or a default of this percentage of children in a child development center must be typically developing peers, or this percentage of children served in a child development center must be developmentally delayed.
Mr. Chairman. Follow up?
On the same line?
Yeah.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I know in my community, the 0 to 2 group has often been served in the home. And is that typical across the state?
Mr. Chairman, yes, it is. Part C services are primarily delivered in the form. It's Part B services that are typically provided through the CDC itself.
Okay, Representative Provenza, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And my question kind of goes back to some earlier discussion that I think we might have missed. So Shelley and Roxanne, if this is a question that maybe you want to answer, but we've been talking about kindergarten readiness and this idea that we want to get kids ready for kindergarten. Great. We currently do not require students to go to kindergarten in the state of Wyoming. That's my understanding. So I'm curious, do we know how many kids that we have that are not attending kindergarten, and maybe what the impact broadly of that is? Because if we're going to talk about pre-K, we're going to talk about how we get our kids ready, I think we also might want to talk about, in conjunction with that, what's the impact of children that don't go to kindergarten for themselves personally, but also in the education system. So I don't know if anyone can speak to that. Hate to take us back out to the 30,000-foot view, but it's something that's kind of been lingering in the back of my mind. Thank you.
Go ahead, Shelley.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Provenza, I don't believe that we have that hard number, but I think we could probably do some work with the number of students that were registered for kindergarten, and then the number of students that were registered the next year for first grade, and come up with, a number that might be representative of that, knowing that there would be students that might have moved into the state that would represent some of those as well. But we could probably come up with some kind of a metric that would identify. So I can get that if you're interested.
Yeah, and if there's any information about how that projects to how they do in first grade, I would love to know that information as well, or how they do on the Y-top, how they do on any of our assessment measures.
So that completes your presentation, right, Matt?
Mr. Chairman, it does.
Okay. We need to go to break because we're all just stretching bladders right now. But we have public comment, and I believe there's one gentleman who'd like to comment. So let's go to public comment real quick, and then we'll go to break.
Mr.
Sir.
Chairman, real quick, just before we go to all the public comment, Shelley invited, at the request of the chairman, some school districts who offer preschool programs to testify on their experiences with those. And so I don't know if you want to hear that as part of the public comment, before public comment. I just want to give you kind of an idea that there is additional testimony that may inform some other public comment. So I'll leave that to you, is your discretion. But I just wanted to advise you of that.
Thank you. So we're still going to go to break, but let's have one person do public comment if they'd like, and then we're going to go to break for 10 minutes and then come back and go back at it. So sir, if you'd like to, are you wanting to have public comment?
Mr. Chairman, I do, but I'd like to hear more discussion.
All right. Then we'll be at break. We're going to be at break till 10:45. going again, so if everybody have a seat, we'll take off. I know, I tried. I had to go out and round you guys up. Crack a whip. Yeah. There you go.
I'm just trying to avoid pulling the plugs out.
Yeah. Good luck. Just don't fall down.
Okay, so we'll start back up and we have with us Lachelle Brandt and Elliot Regenstein. Sorry, I had to read it. I knew it was Elliot, but so you guys take off, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'm Lachelle Brandt, Governor Gordon's Deputy Policy Director. And as the chairman said, Elliot is joined with me today, and Wyoming's fortunate to have his expertise over the past 4 years, really focused on strengthening our early education system in Wyoming. And he was instrumental a few years ago in bringing forward governance recommendations to this committee. And then, as you heard earlier, he's worked on the early childhood integrated data system that our office felt very strongly about in the absence of SLEDs, that this committee and the legislature have good data in order to make policy decisions. And I know some of the discussions that have happened over the last few years with early literacy and in this topic has been challenging because there hasn't been a lot of data. And what I will tell you, you raised many great questions this morning that can be answered now by that early childhood integrated system. And it's why we felt strongly in the budget that that system continue in the Department of Family Services until we're able to integrate it into the bigger system that we continue to work on. So I appreciate the opportunity. I know since I've been in this role for the past 5 years that we've had discussions on governance and but a little different today with the special education funding model that Elliot's going to walk you through in just a few moments. But before we do that, let's begin by revisiting the origins of this work. And as you may recall, in 2019, shortly after the governor took office, he recognized the critical importance of a strong start in a child's educational journey. He also identified the fragmented nature of our early childhood system at the state level. And to address this, the governor seized the opportunity at the time to apply for the federal preschool development grant for Through 5, that is a bipartisan supported grant focused on state systems building. And that's what has supported much of the work that you've heard from about today. Also, thanks to the support of the John P. L. Bogan Foundation in funding a grant writer, Wyoming was awarded $2 million in 2019 to conduct a needs assessment and write a strategic plan for early childhood. In 2021, the state secured an additional $3 million for a 3-year extension grant, and more of the success of the grant can be found on the website that was referenced earlier from the Department of Workforce Services, which is the Wyoming Quality Counts website. Can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. In 2019, Wyoming was ranked 49th for efficiency of early childhood governance. Unfortunately, we have since dropped to 50th as the only state behind us made significant improvements. In 2020, a task force with broad representation from across the state was appointed to recommend improvements to Wyoming's early childhood governance structure that I mentioned a few minutes ago. These recommendations were presented to this committee in 2020, but were not adopted. Concerns at that time really included the need to understand the transition details and the difference in funding between school districts and childhood development centers. So following that, in 2021, some key policy issues were identified that were negatively impacting Wyoming's fragmented system. The 2 issues identified in 2021 were prioritized for follow-up in 2022, and they included special education evaluation and special education financing. Work groups with representation from the governor's office, the Wyoming Department of Health, the Wyoming Department of Education, school districts and child development centers were established, leading to recommendations for improving early childhood special education implementation. As described previously, the current state funds early childhood special education by providing a per child dollar amount fixed in statute. As Mr. Petrie pointed out, CDCs then count their children served on 1 day per year and are reimbursed accordingly. The financing analysis found on a per child per year basis that CDCs receive 51 cents for every dollar received by school districts. One of the core recommendations of the special education financing group was to develop a special education formula. So a successor work group began this task in late 2023 last year, and they approved their recommendations recently, and a final report will be issued soon. And before I pass it to Elliot, I just want to conclude by emphasizing that a fundamental function of early childhood governance is ensuring that services are funded in a way that meets the needs of children and families. And through a multi-year process engaging a wide range of stakeholders, Wyoming has made numerous recommendations for strengthening early childhood governance. And one of those focuses on how to best fund early childhood special education. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to pass it to Elliot to walk you through a proposed funding formula with the committee.
Welcome, Elliot.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Give me a second. I'm going to try to share my screen here. All right. So, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you so much for having me here today. And as Lachelle said, we, and I think we mentioned this when we were in front of you last year. Yeah. For some reason, it's not showing up. Hold on a sec. All right, apologies. My teenage children would make fun of me for my inability to use technology. So, I very much appreciated, obviously, Matt's explanation of the current system for funding early childhood special education in Wyoming with the statutorily set number and the external cost adjustments and the process that must be gone through. But that one of the things that the financing work group had recommended in 2023 was that we move away from that system and move to something that looks more like a formula with predictable inputs, more similar to how K-12 is funded. And so basically, we put together a work group to design a funding formula, and I'm here today to present the recommendations of that work group. One of the things I do want to emphasize at the beginning is recognizing that the appropriations process is never predictable, that we wanted to produce a formula that would show how much the real cost is to CDCs, but that has a proration function so that if the legislature is unable to appropriate the full amount in a given year, that as long as it's meeting its maintenance of effort, that it can do that. So that makes it possible to adopt the formula without tying your hands in the appropriations process, which we thought was important, understanding the pressures that you face on that front. So I'm going to focus today mostly on the overall approach that the work group took. we did produce a set of underlying mechanics that show that this can work. I do want to flag that the LSO sent us a very thoughtful set of questions to which we sent an initial response about some of those mechanics. And that I will just say, when it comes to the mechanics, there is clearly some room for variation and tweaking within the broader framework that the work group approved. And I think the general tenor of the work group was that they were much more focused on the overall approach, and that we wanted to put out mechanics that work and provide a starting point for conversation, but that if there are changes to that mechanics, I think the work group would largely stand behind the approach, based on that. So, okay. So this was briefly discussed in the previous session, but again, with services for infants and toddlers, each infant and toddler in the special education system gets an individualized family service plan. For 3 to 5 year olds, it's called an individualized education program. And that with each of these, there is a specific plan supporting that child's support. And there are a whole host of services that are provided by the child development centers, which again are listed on the slide. Oh, sorry, now we're both trying to do it. Okay, why is this important? But I think we figured it out. So why is early childhood special education important? Again, the early years are critical for learning and development. Early intervention and early childhood special ed can decrease the need for special education in K-12, reducing later expenses. And also it can help families, right? It helps them navigate the system and support their child's learning and growth. So you saw this map before. These are the CDC regions, and that's how services are delivered for special education in Wyoming. So in our work, right, we engaged with the CDCs, the Department of Health, the Department of Education, the governor's office, and brought in the Center for Early Learning Funding Equity. And they are folks who are way better at working with spreadsheets than I am, among other things. But that really to, again, develop the mechanics of a formula that could be workable and could make it, produce stable and predictable funding for the child development centers. So again, in our work group, Foresight, my law firm, and Selfie staffed that, and we brought together leaders from inside and outside government to have these conversations. And we started by defining the problem, right? Again, we came into it knowing that there was dissatisfaction with the current approach and the pressures it puts on the legislature and on the CDCs. The biggest challenge we identified was funding for 3 to 5 year olds, right? That in fact, the way Part C is funded seems to be stable for the CDCs and workable. Another part of it, and this was something that was touched on in the previous conversation, is that CDCs are responsible for ensuring that children they are serving are receiving services in a setting with children who are not receiving special education services, and that in some instances they can do that through a local Head Start or a TANF pre-K, but in some cases they really just have to pay for that child to receive the service themselves, and that can be a pretty substantial expense. One other thing to flag, and this will come up a couple of times, is that most of the state, the costs were relatively similar, except in the Jackson area, where they are just simply much higher. Across the state, though, recruiting and retaining qualified staff is a major problem. CDCs are competing with school districts who are often able to pay more or provide better benefits. And there are numerous staff shortages in these areas anyway. So this was a point that was raised earlier as well, but that there are times where the CDCs have identified children with needs and are struggling to bring in the staff needed to serve them. And that obviously has implications for families and receiving access to services. So what we were trying to do in developing a formula, there were a number of principles we had in mind: using an accurate child count, creating predictable funding, right? So that CDCs can plan for the services they're going to have to deliver, to accommodate the complexities of early childhood special ed in larger context to be based on the actual cost of providing services, right? That it should be based on real expenses inherent in the work. That it should be simple to update and consistent with how the state funds other services, and that it should reflect high quality experiences, right? That's what we're trying to do, is provide high quality experiences for children and families. So we used a cost modeling approach that was meant to build a funding formula that was equitable and adequate for both Part B and Part C services. We based that on sort of a typical program with strong business practices. This work was informed by extensive data collection. I'll talk about that shortly. And then again, we worked with CDCs, state administrators, and other experts to make sure that we were building a model for adequate funding.
Mr. Chairman, could I ask a question?
Go ahead, Senator Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just before we get too far into this, on your funding formula, did you take into account the availability of state resources? So, for example, we've just come from the Agriculture Committee where we had some visits with the BLM and the fact that we're shutting down the Powder River Basin for new coal leasing. The BLM RMP in Rock Springs that's trying to shut down and transition to conservation leasing as a multiple use rather than our extractive industries. So what is your component that attaches all of this to the ability of the state to fund these projects?
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Senator Steinmetz. That's a great question. So the way we approached that, because that's obviously a critical concern, was that's why we built in a proration mechanism. That what the formula does is tell you, here's what we think the services are going to cost, but that the legislature can then say, okay, this year we can fund that at the 70% level, the 80% level, and that at least the manner in which the money is being distributed is based on actual costs. We'll get to all of this will be later in the presentation, but that basically right now, based on the formula, the state is funding it at about the 70% level. So that the state could say, okay, this year we can't get to 80%, but we can get to 75%. That represents an increase. And that would be a choice the legislature could make. But we definitely did not assume that the legislature was going to have available funds to fund the formula at 100%. Worth noting, as Matt said earlier, though, that the legislature can't cut funding because of federal maintenance of effort requirements. Like that the federal government requires the state to keep spending at least as much money as it has been spending. And that's, again, sort of outside our control.
Can you remind us what the consequences are if we go below the maintenance of effort? Do they try to recapture previous? What are we in for if we do that?
Go ahead, Elliot.
Mr. Chairman, I would probably defer to Mr. Petrie on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, in effect, what this does is it has a punitive effect on the Department of Education because, again, federal funding flows to the Department of Education for Part B and then through education to the Department of Health. So yes, the federal government can basically fine the Department of Education out of compliance for violating maintenance of effort, and there can be punitive damages, financial damages for that. I can tell you that in the last round of budget cuts, Part C, these were budget cuts that I believe were implemented in 2021, roughly 16% across programs. Part C typically shoulders more of a budget cut than Part B because the maintenance of effort requirements for Part B are much stricter than they are for Part C. Keep in mind that Part B is federally required, Part C is not. And so when we find ourselves in a situation where the state general fund appropriation for the program is reduced, typically Part C shoulders a greater proportion of that cut in funding because of the maintenance of effort requirement by the federal government. Mr. Chairman, if I may, just maybe as a bit more clarification, when there was a budget cut, again, roughly 3 years ago, and state general fund monies were cut to the program, there was a situation that the Department of Education found itself in where, in fact, there was that question about satisfying maintenance of effort. And essentially what happened there was school foundation program funds were used to backfill to some degree the state general fund that was cut to put the Department of Education in compliance with the federal government and avoid any kind of a compliance issue with the federal government. So the state of Wyoming addressed it, but did so basically by using school foundation program funds to essentially backfill a budget cut.
I would say to the committee members, particularly the newer committee members, this is cause not to accept federal money that has maintenance of effort requirements. They're trouble.
Elliot, do you want to go ahead?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So for this process, we wanted the formula to be grounded in data. So to describe briefly how we did that, we used state level data on salaries. We used individual CDC budgets, right? And thanks to them for sharing those budgets with us. Our work group met 3 times. And in addition to that, we had focus groups with therapists, with teachers. We did our own survey and used some BHD salary survey data. A lot of time with state staff from both BHD and WDE, understanding how their processes work, met with staff on childcare, met with the Head Start Association, and had a number of other individual conversations as needed. So our process was basically we built our knowledge base, did a lot of data discovery, did some analysis and defined some parameters. We tested out some different options and then worked with the work group to present our final recommendations. So first, and this came up in the earlier session as well, with the child count, certainly agree that the May 1st date has certain benefits, but that in numerous formulas with child counts in education, there are multiple counts, and that in this program in particular, there does seem to be some seasonal variation. So we recommend a child count completed twice a year, on May 1st, which is the new date, December 1st, which is the old date. And that also, because of fluctuations in enrollment, to potentially use a 3-year rolling average of annual counts, which again provides more predictability for each of the CDCs, especially when there can be substantial fluctuations. So that was one piece of the recommendation. The rest of the recommendation is focused on cost drivers. What are the actual costs to the CDCs? And we broke those into 4 categories. 2 of them, the numbers that we have, are based on the actual current cost. And those are child fine costs and the cost of providing a free and appropriate education, public education, which again is the need to put them in a non-restrictive service where they're engaging with other kids who don't have IEPs. There are 2 aspects of the formula that are based on sort of best practice data. One is the cost of administration, and the other is the actual cost of services, right? And that is, as you'd expect, one of the primary cost drivers is how much does it cost to actually deliver special education? All right, so on child find, we recommend doing this by formula. CDCs are contractually obligated to conduct child find activities, including developmental screenings and comprehensive assessments, and that while some CDCs receive funding from school districts for these services, that's not a standardized practice. So because this is required in their contracts, we thought it was worth including in the formula, and that basically we came up with an estimated cost, and thought that the formula should take the actual number of children screened and have it be based on that cost. So at this point, about 18% of kids under 5 are being screened. That number may change over time. There are also other children who may be screened by pediatricians or school districts, and that wouldn't be counted, but that basically the idea is that when a CDC actually conducts a screening, that it should be reimbursed for that. This is, I should say, a relatively small part of the overall cost, and you'll see that later. This is a big part of the cost, the free and appropriate public education, because again, it is the obligation of the CDCs to make sure that every child with an IEP is receiving an education in a setting with other children who do not have IEPs. There are 3 basic ways that that happens. One is, as was suggested earlier, some CDCs operate their own classrooms and have their IEP kids in with other children who are enrolled, sometimes paying tuition, right? Another is that if they don't do that, they can purchase a slot in somebody else's program for their IEP child to receive services there. A third is that if there is a publicly funded program like Head Start or TANF Pre-K or Title I Pre-K, that the child can receive services in that setting. So what the formula anticipates is that when CDCs actually have to pay out of pocket for the child to receive a free appropriate public education, that they should be reimbursed for those costs. And in order to do that, the way we calculated it was we actually took, because we didn't want to add a lot of data collection burden, we actually took the Part Day subsidy rate used by the Department of Family Services for childcare and used that in the formula, so that if the child is receiving half-day school year services, that they would receive the Part Day rate, and that if they're receiving full-day, full-year services, they would receive twice the Part Day rate. And again, that's only for children who the CDC is purchasing a slot. There is a small special needs stipend that the CDCs would get even when they were providing the services directly, or if the child was receiving free services, because there is some administrative cost in managing that. But that basically the idea is to align with the current cost of preschool and the current childcare funding system by using the subsidy rate as a benchmark. And again, that's something that will be automatically updated by the Department of Family Services over time. Another significant cost is administration, right? That you do need managers to run these CDC programs. And so what we tried to do was echo what the school funding formula does when it comes to administrative costs, and essentially determine a few functions that each CDC should have and provide them funding to hire people for those functions. Again, it's a model so that the CDCs may they may not hire exactly these roles. They may combine them a little differently, but the idea is that we are providing them money to fulfill these services that they then have the flexibility to do something with. So in the school funding formula, for districts with under 500 children, there's allocation for 3 professional staff. Most CDCs fall in that category, so we recommended allotting funding basically based on that. There is also funding in the formula for non-personnel costs, right? Like supplies, copiers, computers, and things like that, and that is updated yearly. So we also proposed giving that to the CDCs as well. I believe that LSO pointed out that our per child administrative cost is actually based on last year, so that would need to be updated. But again, the whole point of the formula is that the numbers get automatically updated each year and in other formulas, and that they could be updated in this one. So we did, as the school district formula distinguishes between large and small districts, so too does our formula distinguish between larger and smaller CDCs, and that there is slightly more administrative staffing required at a larger operation. So again, this would provide a salary allocation based on how many children overall are being served in order to fulfill the administrative requirements of overseeing the program. And this does also include both salary and benefits. the next major element of the funding formula is therapeutic services. This is the actual work of providing special education services. And we used personnel survey data, a lot of listening sessions with therapists and teachers to understand where the costs are actually coming from, and worked to calculate an average cost per child that is based on services, right? Like how much service is actually being required, desired caseloads, salaries, and best practices. So again, we established a median caseload for special education services. We established salaries. We determined sort of how likely these services are to be given, and then calculated a total cost of therapeutic services that came out to about $9,680, a little between $9,000 and $10,000 for both Part B and Part C children. And obviously, again, we've got the spreadsheets that break that down in more detail. So in our proposal, there are numerous elements of the formula that are tied to some other portion, some other data that is collected in Wyoming. And this slide summarizes what those are. Again, one of the questions from LSO is that some of our formula recommendations were to tie it to salaries as reported by Department of Ed, and could we tie those instead to Bureau of Labor Statistics data, to which we would say, sure, we could absolutely do that. And so, but basically the idea is that the vast majority of the data in the system is already being collected, and that it wouldn't create a new burden on the agencies to do this. And that, again, there were some estimations or things that we had to build into that we can talk through if necessary, but that this is basically the building blocks of the formula. As I signaled at the beginning, one region is more expensive than the others, and that was Region 4. So because of its higher cost of living, we built the formula with a toggle so that you can turn on a cost of living adjustment or turn it off as the legislature sees fit. But we definitely wanted to make sure that this was an option that you understood because of the higher expenses in this region. So again, 4-part formula reflecting the actual costs of delivering services. And to go back to Senator Steinmetz's question from earlier, it is possible to prorate. We built the formula to prorate at least the therapeutic services and administration aspects of the formula, in part because the other 2 parts of the formula are based on actual costs incurred, whereas this is based on projected costs. So and it is fair to say that the way the formula is built does project higher reimbursement than what the current situation is. And so given that, we knew that it might not be possible for the legislature to fund all of that at once. And so we created a proration function that allows the legislature to see what the formula would recommend it costs, but then to fund it at potentially a somewhat lower level, and to sort of potentially build that up over time. One other thing to think about is that some of the CDCs, I think there's maybe a question.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Clausen has a question online.
Go ahead, Representative Clausen.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for this presentation. I had one question on the formula. A superintendent salary, it looks like it was used for the director instead of maybe a principal. I look at our school district and our superintendent's in charge of 23 schools, where a principal's in charge of 1 school. So just the methodology of looking at a superintendent's pay versus a principal's.
So in the superintendent was only used in the larger CDC context, where, again, we thought that that was going to be a larger operation, and that was compared to, I believe, the superintendent salary in a smaller school district. Again, all of that was meant to provide a starting point for conversation, and if there's some other number that would be more appropriate for that, we could absolutely plug that in instead. So one other thing to think about is that some of the CDCs, not all, do bill Medicaid for portions of the services they provide. And so the formula does include an offset for that if it is funded at 100%. Our theory was that if the state is fully funding the cost of services, that Medicaid reimbursement would be essentially sort of double funding. That having been said, for now, it makes a lot of sense for the CDCs to be seeking Medicaid reimbursement because of the gap between what the state covers and the actual expenses. And that for, so for the foreseeable future, that wouldn't kick in, but we did want to acknowledge that CDCs are billing Medicaid. Again, the work group thought that was a good thing because it's bringing federal money in to provide these services, but that again, we just wanted to acknowledge that that is part of the overall funding package. So again, the final result that we produced is a tool, right? It is an overall approach to funding. All of the variables can be adjusted, right? Again, we could use a different set of salaries. To the question from earlier, some of these things are meant to sort of be updated over time, but that we really wanted to start with an overall approach that was workable and are happy to discuss further the mechanics. And part of what we did is that we built the spreadsheets, and there will be training provided for agency staff on how to operate them so that it can be managed on an ongoing basis. But our hope is that the new approach does all the things we set out to do, right? Use an accurate child count, have a predictable funding, fit early childhood special ed in larger context, be driven by the actual cost of providing services, be simple to update, and again, reflect high quality practice. So in looking at the actual formula, here is what actually drives the cost. You can see a significant majority of the funding is for therapeutic services and actually delivering special education. The second largest part is the free and appropriate public education, right? That they need to be, paying for a full day of preschool or childcare in another setting is expensive. That Child Find is a relatively small part of it, and that then administrative funding is also a comparatively smaller part of it. But that this summarizes, based on the formula as written, sort of what would come out of that. In terms of actual numbers, again, this compares the sort of current approach to what the formula would kick out. You can see that it does produce a substantial increase in the cost per Part B child. A little bit of that is driven by an increase in child count, but much of it is driven by the formula. And again, that's why we included a proration. And as you see that the current spending would be at about 70% of the proration, and that this compares to the per child spending in school districts of about $18,000. So in terms of implementation considerations, one of the things that a different work group looked at was how can we make it possible to reduce spending by potentially using shared services for special ed evaluation. I won't go into that in detail, but that's something that could be looked at to help reduce costs. With Child Find, there probably is some sorting out that needs to be done between the roles of CDCs and school districts. And with the cost of quality, again, we modeled what we thought was going to be quality special ed services, but there may well be deeper ways to go into that that the state might look at over time. So that's a lot, and I appreciate you bearing with it, especially after having gotten a pretty dense presentation right before it. But again, really grateful for the time and opportunity and happy to answer any questions.
Go ahead, Senator Rothfuss, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could we go back about 4 slides or 3 slides to the total cost slide for a moment? That one. Sorry, one forward. One forward from there we go. So whether it's current approach or the new formula, one of the things that we've heard a lot about is the fact that while those are average numbers that we see there for Part C and Part B, and particularly in the new formula, it's an average with an incredible standard deviation depending on the services that are actually provided. And you might have one child or 2 children that need substantial services, and maybe they are at $40,000 or $50,000 of required services for that year. That's one of the reasons why on the K-12 side, we end up doing a 100% reimbursement, recognizing that there's no way small districts in particular could accommodate receiving an average payment, and then recognizing that there are no students that actually come in showing up as the average Part B child that we see in the graph. Was there any discussion about looking at this as more of a hybrid model where you recognize that you might need a 100% reimbursement style approach as we do in K-12 for the services side, but look at perhaps a model on those types of things that we see in the previous slide on the graph, that would be the ones that you wouldn't prorate effectively. The child find and the FAPE would seem like they would be based on your children count much more consistently with our K-12 formula.
Senator, Chairman, if I may. Senator, that's a great question. And in fact, we did have some relatively extensive discussion about that. We just had an extremely hard time. We were attempting to build out a cost model that would account for those outliers, and we just weren't really able to do it because the N size is so small. So there were a couple of things that we did. One is, again, to try to build in the rolling averages and some of the changes in the count that can provide a little bit more predictability. These kids are in the system for a shorter time than they are in K-12. So, if they're 3 or 4, they're going to be a 1 or 2 year blip, as opposed to in K-12 where they might be a 10-year, a 10-year carrying cost. I suspect that everybody on the work group would have been in favor of a model that provides full reimbursement for the actual costs of children in those circumstances. But I think we worried that that was a little more ambitious to ask for. And so we tried to build a formula that would insulate CDCs to some degree against those expenses while not explicitly accounting for them. Certainly, if there was legislative desire to do that, we could build that in.
One other thing we did, which maybe it's a little easier, I recognize what you're saying, but at one point, I remember that we created a special funding pool to provide additional resources for special education students that went, and I'm trying to remember what the context was because it wasn't under a 100% reimbursement case, but a special pool for higher cost individuals that would almost act as an insurance pool that could be drawn upon. So as a variation on this, just having perhaps a standard average rate, but then recognizing that maybe for certain students, there could be a capacity to apply back to a fund for students that have high educational needs. I just think that the average amount is going to work on the average time, but that we'll end up with circumstances where it might cause problems, as we do now. And that's a criticism of the current system, obviously, also. But as we're looking to a new way to calculate it, it would be good if we resolved the problems that we see under the current system. And this is certainly a problem under the current system, are those that are just substantially higher cost students than what we have as designated average. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Scott, please go ahead.
Follow up on that. Under the current circumstances, and Chairman, this may be a question we'll have to ask the CDCs later on, but how do they handle a kid like that? Do they have troubles with them? What kind of trouble is there? How is it managed currently?
Go ahead, Elliot.
Mr. Chairman, we had some conversations about that, but I would not want to lose anything in translation and would suggest that the CDCs speak directly to that. I mean, from my understanding, it involves a lot of cobbling together from different sources. Some CDCs have more available resources beyond what the state is providing them, but that it's a huge struggle for them, right? That this, and in some cases in a smaller CDC, enough of if it was enough of a burden, it could represent almost an existential threat.
Go ahead, Senator Brennan.
Thank you. On that free and appropriate education, is that federally mandated?
Mr. Chairman, yes, that's a federal requirement.
Follow up.
Yeah. And then where do we find, is that in rules somewhere, in law? Like, where do we find how they define that free and appropriate education?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that's in the IDEA statute itself and the accompanying regs, but I would defer to,
Question over here from Representative Obermueller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just the structure of CDCs themselves, are all of these CDCs privately owned nonprofits, or how are they structured?
Go ahead, Elliot.
Mr. Chairman, I would probably defer to Matt on that one.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Obermueller, yes, that is correct. They're all structured as nonprofits.
A follow-up, Mr. Chairman. So under the formula for K through 12, there are a lot of parameters set in terms of square footages of facilities, formulaic number of teachers per student, all of these kind of formulas. Do you anticipate that kind of structure within the CDCs mandated through these formulas?
Mr. Chairman, I think we anticipated that the regulatory regime would exist for CDCs would exist and evolve much as it has, right? That we weren't proposing to add new requirements or take away any requirements. We were proposing to fund the system as it is, and build a formula that accounts for the existing requirements that CDCs are subject to. Certainly what this would do is mean that in the future, if you were because they're already subject to requirements relating to their physical space and their personnel. It would mean that if in the future the legislature was making substantial changes, or the legislature or the executive branch was making any substantial changes to those requirements, they would have to think about the implications of that for the formula. But you could, if there was a desire to change those requirements, tweak the formula to accommodate for that.
Go ahead, Senator Scott. Chairman Scott.
The federal requirements, and particularly the one on the free and appropriate education. The feds are providing a very small percentage of the money here and a lot of the requirements. My understanding is that some of those requirements wouldn't go away if you refuse the federal money. Is that true in this particular case or not?
Mr. Chairman, I would want to defer to Matt on that.
Mr. Chairman, I may also have to defer to the CDCs, but I will tell you this, that keep in mind that the Part B portion of the program itself is part of a much larger federal mandate that actually is in place for children, individuals 3 through 21. And so there are aspects of the federal regulations that govern everything that's done in K-12 school districts and extends down to children ages 3, 4, and 5. So I think in short, I think that the answer to your question is yes.
Representative Lawley has a question. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for all this work. It's very interesting. Just want to make sure I understood in your formula, if a CDC offers half-day programs versus full-day, they receive different funding under the model. Is that correct?
So that's just for, Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so that's just for the free and appropriate public education aspect of the services they provide. So for example, if a child has a need for physical therapy, the therapeutic services portion of the formula pays for whatever the cost of that physical therapy is. But that then if they're getting that in the context of a half-day pre-K program, if they're only going to a half-day pre-K program, the formula, the CDCs are expected to reimburse for that half-day pre-K, and that this formula would then reimburse the CDC for that expense. If the child was going to a full-day pre-K that the CDC was paying for, the CDC would be fully reimbursed for that full day. If the child was in a Head Start program, then the CDC would just get the administrative cost because Head Start would be paying for that full day of education. The CDC is getting reimbursed for the physical therapy services regardless of setting, and that the only variable is how much time are they getting in that inclusive setting, and that's what that part of the formula reimburses for.
Follow up?
Go ahead.
Thank you. So I'm trying to understand the distinctions, how the distinctions are made among the CDCs about half-day being an appropriate, fair and appropriate education for one setting, and in another setting, a full day meets that requirement. Just that inconsistency, there may be reasons for it, but how does that match with that concept?
Go ahead, Elliot.
Mr. Chairman, I think a lot of that is actually parent driven, right? Some parents may only want their child to receive, be receiving half-day services. Some parents may want their child to be in full-day services. Some of it is about availability, right? That in some communities, there may or may not be full-day services available or part-day services available. But that ultimately, because none of that is required, because it's parent driven, the formula has to account for the fact that different parents are going to choose different things. We didn't, in the course of our work, study how appropriate any of those placements might have been, but that there is and again, the CDCs could probably speak to this in more detail, but that one way or another, we thought there has to be flexibility because different parents may want different things for their children, and that the formula has to account for that.
Okay, one more follow-up.
So
Go
I
ahead.
understand that, but I guess my question goes to more the meeting the federal requirement. Like, that's really what I'm trying to understand is there, do we have to meet a standard, and is the variance between these creating sort of issue? I'm not saying it does. I'm just asking the question, really.
Go ahead, Elliot.
Mr. Chairman, I would want to defer to the CDCs on that. Again, I think that some of that is going to be tied to each individual child's IFSP or IEP, and maybe I can just defer to Shelley on that.
You can phone a friend.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Lawley. So to be clear, FAPE stands for Free and Public Education, of course, and that is individually determined for each child that qualifies for services. So it's not necessarily parent-driven. Parents are an integral part of that IEP team that helps determine what the student's needs are, and based on comprehensive assessment, that team, including all of the specialists, the special education teacher, the parents, determine what that FAPE package looks like for an individual child.
Thank you.
Representative Overmyer, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So in the formula, our CDC is trying to preserve their ability to hire who they want, determine their own qualifications for those people, determine their education level, determine their continuing education, all the aspects of employment.
Go ahead, Elliot.
Mr. Chairman, we started with the premise that all the requirements on CDCs for personnel and, qualifications would remain the same as they are now. So we didn't, and that this would reserve to the CDCs as much control as they currently have to, hire the personnel they want, as long as they meet the requirements of providing the services.
A follow-up, Mr. Chairman. And yet you want to tie their compensation to public education compensation?
Mr. Chairman, we used those as a frame of reference, and that's mostly on the administrative side. Again, the suggestion had come from LSO to use BLS data, and that would also work. So if that's a sticking point, like, that could very easily be changed.
Thank you.
Anybody else have a question for Elliot or Lachelle? Go ahead, Matt.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to make a clarification. I didn't recommend anything to the governor's office. I just queried methodology in terms of some of the numbers, and it's not my place to make a recommendation of the governor's office. So I just want to make that clear. It was a lack of consistency across their numbers, and I just want to understand why. That was it.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I appreciate that clarification and didn't mean to imply anything improper about LSO's role. And they did ask a number of good clarifying questions. We had you know, in developing the formula, made a number of judgment calls along the way. And some of those are certainly ones that, you know, the questions asked raised good points that we'd be happy to follow up on, but that the main goal was to produce a sort of overall framework and approach. And we appreciated the thoughtful questions. I certainly didn't want to mischaracterize them.
Go ahead, Chairman Scott.
Mr. Chairman, I'm having a little struggle on this whole, the FAPE part of this formula. You're spending money because you want kids, normal kids in the classroom with the others. That makes sense to me, but that's a service that people pay for. And there's a market for it. Why does it wind up such a large expense for us? I'm not quite clear. Is that strictly where the CDC does not maintain a classroom?
Go ahead, Elliot.
Mr. Chairman, in the case where the child has an IEP or an IFSP, that the free appropriate public education is part of that and must be publicly paid for. That's IDEA's requirement. So that's why when the CDC is out of pocket for that expense, that the formula seeks for the CDC to be reimbursed for that. If, you know, a CDC can open a preschool classroom or a childcare setting and charge tuition for that, but that any of the children in that room who have an IEP, you can't charge the parents for that preschool service if it's part of the IEP. And that's why the formula reimburses for it.
Okay, so it's a quarter till, and there's at least one gentleman here that would like to have public comment before we leave for lunch. So is it a short
It's super
question?
brief.
Go ahead.
And it was
Senator.
actually just a clarification. So when I was discussing a previous policy, the concept was our out of district placement appropriation from a few years ago as the model. And I appreciate somebody providing me with that information so that we could clarify it. But I think it's potentially a good model to help give backstop support for high cost individuals. You might want to look to that as this is being refined. Thank you.
Good point. Okay, so I'd like to do is go to public comment, give this gentleman a chance to have a chance to comment before noon. And so if he doesn't want to come back after lunch, then he has that opportunity. But if he wants to come back, you're certainly welcome. And then we'll come back and we'll revisit this at 1:30 and start again. Take Elliot off the hot seat for an hour and a half and give him a chance to recover. And then we'll ask for school district's input and move from there. So with that, we'll go to public comment. Sir, if you'd like. All right. That's appropriate. You're welcome to stay. I just wanted to make sure to extend the opportunity. I did. Okay. So with that, you know what? We're going to go to lunch and we'll be back here at 1:30. How's that?